What's going on, everybody? Kalipus Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, I'm going to be giving you some reasons why you might not want the TCL 30XL. Now, a little disclaimer here, these kinds of videos do tend to be a little nitpicky, and not everyone is really going to care about everything here. This video is really just meant to give you a better idea of the potential downsides of this phone, because after all, every phone, no matter what it is still going to have its cons, and not every device is going to make sense for everyone. So if you do go through this video and realize these cons really aren't a big deal to you, then that could be a sign that this phone might actually be a good fit for you. So definitely keep this in mind. Now, that being said, before we go any further, I do want to remind you to hit that subscribe button, and if you want to learn more about this phone, I will be linking to several other videos about it in the description, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and my favorite accessories for it. But with all that being said, let's get into it. So my first reason why you might not want the TCL 30XL is the processor. Now with this phone, we're getting 6GB of RAM with the MediaTek Helio 825 processor. Now 6GB for an entry-level phone like this is actually quite a bit of RAM, so I will give it that. But in general, this processor really isn't very fast. Sure, if you're doing really basic activities like just using the phone as a phone, sending text messages, making calls, streaming content like videos and music, and maybe some light web browsing and social media use, with those kinds of activities, this phone will get the job done. But if you're going to be on your phone a lot, or maybe you're doing higher performance activities like mobile gaming, for example, in that kind of situation, you're most likely going to notice this is really not a very fast phone. Now, I did run a Geekbench 5 benchmark test on it, and as you can see, here are the results right here. Again, it's really not a very fast phone, but what I recommend doing is running this test on your current phone and comparing your results to these, and that's going to give you a better idea of whether or not this phone is going to be an upgrade for you. And honestly, unless you're coming from a really low-end phone, it most likely won't be. But again, in general, if you're looking for a higher performance device, and you're really just going to be on your phone a lot, then the TCL 30XL is probably not going to be the best option. But that being said, again, if you're just really doing basic activities like sending text messages, making calls, streaming content like videos and music, and some really light web browsing and social media use, this phone will at least get the job done. The second reason why you might not want the TCL 30XL is because there's no wireless charging. Now, on one hand, wireless charging is really not a feature that's commonly found in phones that aren't flagship phones, and considering that this is really an entry-level phone, not having wireless charging here is really not a surprise at all. But that being said, there's still a growing number of phones in this price range, like the Cricket Dream 5G and the Blue F91 5G to name a few, that do actually have this feature. So it's not like it's a crazy expensive feature to implement, it's just something manufacturers typically tend to leave out. And although wireless charging obviously isn't like a life-changing feature or anything, it still is a nice thing to have, especially in these lower end phones, because if something happens to your charging port, you're either going to have to fix it or replace the phone. And with a phone like this, it's probably not going to be worth it to fix it, so you're basically just going to have to get a new phone. But with wireless charging, if something did happen to your charging port, you would still be able to charge the phone even without a charging port. So in a way, I feel like wireless charging would be even more useful in lower end phones. And even besides that, the convenience factor is definitely nice. Wireless charging does help with cable management after all, so it is really too bad that we're not seeing wireless charging in more lower end phones. But that being said, of course, not everyone uses wireless charging, and if your current device already doesn't have it, then this phone not having it either is probably not going to be a drawback for you. My third reason why you might not want the TCL 30XL is the 720p display. Now, on one hand, overall, I do think this phone's display for what it is pretty good. This phone has a 6.82-inch LCD display with a 720p resolution, a PPI of 270, an aspect ratio of 20.5:9, and a 90% screen to body ratio. So again, overall, for a more entry-level phone, I do think the TCL 30XL is actually a pretty good choice if you're consuming a lot of content. But that being said, despite the image looking pretty good, it still only has a 720p resolution, and honestly, even in this price range, you really don't have to spend a whole lot more to get a 1080p resolution. So if you are consuming a lot of content and having a really good quality image is important to you, this is definitely something to think about. But that being said, to be fair, aside from just having a 720p resolution, everything else about the display on this phone is pretty nice. At 6.82 inches, this is definitely a really large display, and that's going to make things a lot easier to see. So whether you're doing something like watching videos, looking at photos, or even just reading, you are going to get a pretty nice experience here. And in addition to this, with the 20.5:9 aspect ratio, we're getting a tall and narrow form factor, and this is going to give you a more immersive experience in landscape mode. And if you're doing something like reading an article or scrolling through social media, you'll be able to fit more content on the screen without having to scroll as much. So in general, while it is a little disappointing that we're only getting 720p here, especially considering there are plenty of phones just a tiny bit more expensive than this one that have 1080p resolutions for what it is, I still would say this phone overall does have a pretty good display. My fourth reason why you might not want the TCL 30XL is the mediocre storage. Now this is really mostly going to apply to power users, because if you're more of an average user or light user and you're not really putting a whole lot on your phone, the 64GB of internal storage you get with this phone, especially with the microSD card expansion, is probably going to be at least okay for you. But if you are more of a power user, if you have a lot of apps and stuff like that, and you're really just doing a lot on your phone, 64GB is going to fill up pretty quickly. And the thing that makes this really a con for this phone isn't really the storage in and of itself, because again, 64GB, while not really the ideal amount of storage, it's still not terrible. But really the thing is, there are plenty of phones around this price range that have 128GB instead. So if you are more of a power user, if you have a bunch of apps and stuff like that, then getting a phone with 128GB is definitely going to be a better choice for you. And again, there are still plenty of options out there within this general price range that do have that kind of storage. So if you are someone who typically fills up the storage on your phone, definitely keep this in mind. Now my fifth reason why you might not want the TCL 30XL is because it doesn't have NFC. Now in case you don't know what it is, NFC is the technology behind contactless mobile payment services. So if you like to use tap and pay, then you do need a phone with NFC to actually be able to do that. And unfortunately with the TCL 30XL, we're not getting that feature. Now is this really a huge surprise? Not really, just because again, while not being the lowest of the low end, the TCL 30XL is still very much an entry-level phone. And while I have seen plenty of entry-level phones that do have NFC, by far not all of them do. In fact, there are even plenty of mid-range phones that don't have it. So when it comes to NFC, at least as of 2022, it may change in a couple years, but right now it's really hit or miss which phones actually have it. Of course, every flagship phone or higher end phone has it, but when you get into the mid-range, there are phones like the Motorola Moto G Stylus that aren't really high end per se, but definitely aren't cheap either, that don't have that feature. And then you get really low end Samsung Galaxy A series phones like the Samsung Galaxy A13 5G for example, that do actually have NFC. So again, it's really hard to say which phones are going to have it and which phones aren't, but if that is an important feature for you, then again, keep in mind, the TCL 30XL does not have NFC, so you're not going to be able to use tap and pay with this phone. The sixth reason why you might not want the TCL 30XL is because the video recording maxes out at 1080p. Now this is yet another thing that's really not very surprising, because again, this is more of an entry-level phone, and the majority of phones in this price range are really not going to be able to record in 4K anyway. But if you are recording lots of videos you want to actually keep for something, then keep in mind that while this phone's video quality really isn't bad per se, since it does have the limitation of only being able to record in 1080p, if video quality is important to you, you might want to consider a slightly higher end device that can record in 4K instead. Now my seventh reason why you might not want the TCL 30XL is because it does not have 5G connectivity. Now in this day and age, 5G connectivity, while not being absolutely necessary, is still obviously becoming more and more relevant and widely used. And with a 5G phone, of course, you're going to get access to the latest and greatest technology, and the 5G network is really only going to expand from here. So I personally feel like getting a 5G phone in 2022 is definitely a good idea, and it's really going to future-proof things because eventually you are going to need a 5G phone. So in my opinion, getting 5G earlier so you don't have to worry about it later is definitely a good idea. But that being said, again, it's not really the end of the world if you have a 4G phone, but if 5G connectivity is important to you, then keep in mind, the TCL 30XL again is only a 4G phone, so you're not going to get 5G connectivity here. But those were my reasons why you might not want the TCL 30XL. Again, this doesn't really mean this is a bad phone, but in general, these are the main reasons why I think this phone might not make sense for everyone. And of course, if you want to learn more about it, including some reasons why you should buy this phone in 2022, I will be linking to several other videos about the phone in the description, so definitely check that out as well. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to follow Kalipis Tech on Twitter and Instagram, and as always, I will see you in the next video.